Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 1/6 review. This will be Into the Wild and Adventure at Weema Bay. And it's really a continuation of Big Two-Hearted River. All of these we could read as adventure stories and their connection to all of our course concepts on environmental literature. So let's leap right in. Let's talk about Into the Wild. We'll talk about your reading questions a little bit. I'm just going to give you the big ideas that should help you be potential answers to the reading questions, which were fairly open. The first thing I'd like to look at, though, which will color our reading and our discussion, is to look at the Into the Wild controversy. If you don't know much about the book, there's a lot of controversy in how the author, Krakauer, discussed the events of Chris McCandless's life, because McCandless is deceased by the time we meet him, by the time Krakauer even learns about him. So we really don't know what McCandless was thinking. And so this has been kind of an issue in the book. Was Krakauer fair, or did he make a lot of assumptions to turn McCandless into a certain type of character? See a lot of articles like this written about not McCandless but Krakauer in the book and the way that the story is told. This is just one from the Anchorage Daily News from Alaska, and you can see it's in 2016, so people are still talking about this out there. It's fairly recent considering this is a story from the 90s, and the book is older than that. Now, if we went through a lot of these, they'd be dealing with the same type of things that we're wrestling with in our course. What types of narratives were used? How is this story told? What traditional frameworks of environmental or nature or adventure stories are relied upon here? And how do those stories fill in the gaps in our thinking in ways that are maybe ethical or unethical or that are questionable or something like this? And that's exactly what this article is doing. Big ideas, then we can talk about McCandless, and we'll compare him as a character to Nick and think of him as a character in its own right and what we know. But we can add an extra layer here that we don't always add to all stories, and that is looking at how the author has decided to depict him. This is important, especially because this is not fiction but nonfiction. This is a real life event, right? So the way that an author depicts someone is bias. Bias isn't bad necessarily. Everybody has it. In all, nonfiction will have bias, but we want to look at what that is and look at how Krakauer is borrowing from ideas we've already learned in the course to tell his story of McCandless, right? So the big idea is, let's examine McCandless as someone who imagines nature for his own reasons, right? And these reasons will represent a very modern human impulse, and that would be to read the story neutrally, as if there's almost no bias, that we can know McCandless in some way. But we could also examine Krakauer's depiction in the writing as biased, how he uses adventure tropes and mystery tropes. This is like a mystery story. Who is Chris McCandless? Why did he do what he did? And he does this to tell a good story as well. The other thing we can do is let's compare this story to Nick from Big Two-Hearted River to clarify McCandless and Krakauer's narrative and some of the things that are going on. So here's what we might say, and I'll try to scroll through the story, but mainly I'll probably just talk through my notes and bring up specific passages that are important passages. So, McCandless in the pastoral. Is McCandless, is he anti-societal? Is he anti-modernist? Remember, being anti-modernist, sort of against civilization, is part of the pastoral. It's not all of it, right? But it is part of it. We know that he's against society. He turned away from society. But here's the interesting thing for us, and we'll talk about the details of this later. He forgoes what might be that soft pastoral, living comfortably in nature, for a very much sort of a hard pastoral life. He's going out, braving elements. He's far from a town. He's not like Thoreau, who was basically 2 miles from town and walked there and walked to the store to get supplies. Notice that McCandless goes way, way out into the almost unreachable places of nature. And this is the only place where he feels he can find himself or commune with nature, if that's his intent, right? Notice he isn't seeking to dominate nature, as we've talked about in the past, going all the way back to our very first readings. He just wants to feed himself and survive. So he is ecological to that extent. We can't just give an ecological reading of the story, even though he dies for ecological readings by eating some poisoned potatoes. That's actually how he dies, it turns out, if you read the whole book. Guess I should have given you a spoiler alert for that. But he's not seeking to dominate nature, but live ecologically. So our questions go elsewhere. Where did he get this idea of nature? What were his motivations? And what stories that he believed from our society gave him the motivation to go out there and potentially endanger and kill himself, right? His beliefs came from somewhere, and it's probably from the way that Americans think about nature, right? So why did he have to do this in such a challenging environment? We could ask ourselves that question. So in some ways, this seems to defy the typical soft pastoral, like I said, the comfortable harmony, and to some extent the hard pastoral, which is going out and conquering the wild and being in awe of the wild. He wants to live ecologically. He doesn't want to dominate it. He wants to survive, right? And survival doesn't equal domination. So in some ways, we could read the story as denying both the soft pastoral and the hard pastoral, the conquering narrative, right? One cool question to ask, to give us some context here, is if he had lived, would this be a daring adventure story? Or would it be sort of a tree-hugging ecological story? Or would it be something else, just a story of living off the land and finding yourself, and becomes a story of sort of transcendence? It would almost feel like Thoreau in some ways. We don't really know. And of course, here's what I want you to see at this point in the course. It would depend how the story is told. We could probably tell that story anyway, because language defines how we see nature. So you could imagine that the story would be told as any of these things, right? And that's really where we want to be at this point in the course. Language defines nature for us. So we've got some other questions here that you can take a look at. Is he seeking communion with nature or escaping? Maybe he can do both at the same time. That's an interesting question to ask. Is he a deep ecologist? This might clarify your own thinking on him. Do you believe that he thinks that nature is more important than humans? Does he believe that humans are still important with nature, but we have to care for the environment? Or does neither of those really matter to him? We might ask questions like, is he an environmentalist, right? I jotted that one down here. Does he speak of humans mistreating the environment? Is that why he's going out there? Not really, right? Again, he's trying to escape civilization, right? So he's trying to get away from something and retreats to the one place where civilization is not nature. But he doesn't seem to maybe have a lot of views on nature, or at least we don't know them, right? I guess if we're looking at spirit, object, or resource, he doesn't like civilization that maybe uses up resources, but he's not an environmentalist and overly concerned about that. He's just trying to get away from society. So he's here in this little triad, but in a very unique way in our course, right? And that he's not an environmentalist. He's not a deeper social ecologist. He doesn't have a lot of views on anything from what we know of him. Where do we go from here? How do the pastoral qualities inform this adventure story? Well, you could take a look at the grid on civilization versus nature and see what you think. Does he have a biocentric view? Does he have an anthropocentric view? Does he have neither? We know he doesn't like people and civilization very much, but he doesn't really seem to care too much for nature. So maybe he doesn't align on the pastoral grid that we've been looking at from Shees way back in module 3. So we have somebody that's sort of in between here, and that's why I gave you this story. It's really fascinating because it breaks down some of our ideas of what environmental writing is, or writing what the environment is. So is he looking for a transcendent experience? Probably. He's looking to invent himself newly, right? So that sounds like he's looking to transcend his old self that was constructed by society. So he's kind of like Thoreau in some ways, even though he's very different in the terrain he chooses to go into. Was he interested in ecology? I'll let you figure that one out. Did he have, here's an interesting question, if we want to start to compare him with Nick. Did he have enough knowledge of nature to survive? Nick had a lot of knowledge of nature. Of course, Nick doesn't go into a dangerous place, so Nick is a very different character. He doesn't go into the marsh, the swamp at the end of his story. And that's kind of where our story Into the Wild begins. It begins in the swamp, so to speak. It begins in the hardest area to survive, right? But Nick had a lot of knowledge, and maybe even didn't go in there because he had that knowledge. And Krakauer makes choices that show McCandless not having that knowledge, because we hear from the local man who picks him up, Jim Gallion, and Jim Gallion recognizes his pack McCandless's pack is too light. He doesn't have the right winter gear. He doesn't have the right rifle. He only has a 22, which isn't enough to bring down big game. So we can see that Nick had a lot of knowledge of what was required, the grasshoppers, right, where to find them, and all of these type of things. But we don't get that from McCandless. So you see some very big differences in their knowledge of the environment. One can ecologically fit in, and one is an outsider. And so to some extent then, we have to ask, does Krakauer make these choices in what he tells us to bias our judgment against McCandless? Some have said that Krakauer's point in Into the Wild is to basically show that McCandless was sort of an impulsive, irrational escapist that was sort of doomed to fail. So he's sort of, while he's heroic in some ways trying to escape society, he wasn't cut out for what he was doing. And so Krakauer gets to make commentary on McCandless, but also how we should live with nature, which is not how McCandless does, because McCandless was irrational and impulsive. And so we can look at what Krakauer is telling us, and how McCandless is being built as a character. Other things that we should probably note before we get into some of the details. Krakauer is showing us where myth comes from, how nature overpowers our imagination. McCandless thought the only way to construct a new self was to go into the middle of nowhere, right, and live in that bus. There are probably other ways to do it. If I wanted to joke, I might say therapy, or a good hobby, or just changing your life, or getting a new job, or something like this, right? But notice how for McCandless, he has to go to a place where civilization simply has not touched the earth, right? And so we can see where some of these narratives in our life are very, very powerful. McCandless is a perfect example then of everything we've talked about in our course, that common narratives about nature define our actions in the world, define ourselves, right? Define our uses of nature and how we think of ourselves as well. Notice other things. Galien is a staple character. He's concerned. There's safety, there's risk. He is, and this is what Krakauer seems to admire. I would call Galien from chapter 1, the trucker who picks him up and gives him a ride, an experienced realist. He's local. He's got local knowledge, versus McCandless, who is the novice who idealizes nature in some way and fails to live well in it, right? And so you can see that there's staple characters, but also that these are being used to portray someone, a real person like Galien. All right. I think what I'm going to do is let you look through my notes, which are fairly detailed, because I'd have an hour worth of video if I was actually going to talk through all of these notes. So I think you'll be able to get from my fairly detailed notes what I'm seeing inside of here. I labeled it page by page. So I'll let you kind of take a look through and see what I'm seeing. You're seeing your own things as well, and that's fine. But you can norm what you saw against what I see here. Notes on the author's notebooks. Let's get into chapter 1 here. One thing that I noticed on page 4 is we could connect this to fall and recovery narratives a little bit if we wanted to. I noticed there's really no stewardship or dominion narratives, domination narratives in here. McCandless is, he's living ecologically, but he's not really, doesn't see himself as a steward of the land. That's why he's going there. He knows it's bigger than him. So he knows he's not going to dominate it. He just needs to try to survive on it in some way. So we have to ask ourselves, well, how does the fall or the recovery narrative, how do these color our interpretations of the story? Well, we could say clearly Alex, aka McCandless, he sees the world as fallen, and for that reason sees his nature as fallen. And where does the recovery come from? Not through technological progress, but just the opposite, actually. He's anti-civilization. So that's a really interesting thing to note here. Usually the fall portends some type of recovery through what people can make or people can do, but he actually has to abandon everything that people have made in order to recover what people's potential or humankind's potential. So that's a really interesting, cool, different connection than we've seen elsewhere in the course. And here are some other notes along with this page. Notice that early on in here, we're starting to get a lot of references to Jack London. I know we didn't read any Jack London, but Jack London was a writer, wrote about Alaska and other places too. One of his famous short stories is To Build a Fire, and it's about a man who wants to go out across nature when he shouldn't. People in town tell him he shouldn't. And he winds up getting too cold to use his tools to stay alive. He burns up all his matches when his hands are cold, and he freezes to death, and his dog runs off to town because the dog is better equipped for this terrain. And so you can see this is really fascinating. Krakauer keeps mentioning here, but also at the beginning of chapter 2, Jack London. And so we're being told the narratives that Krakauer is aware of, but that he wants us to be aware of too. And we have to ask, is he saying that Nick is like the fool who runs off? McCandless is like the fool who runs off and does these things? Or is Krakauer telling us, hey, I'm using these narratives to show you that he might be this type of person? Just how aware does Krakauer want us to be of these narratives?